as I do my tours across Europe and talks across America, the amount of people that tell me that they know all this that's in my book is extraordinary. They know that the name Joy Division is the name of the brothel in Auschwitz, for example. That's what they say they know. I know all about Joy Division. And yet, when I unravel the story and ask them questions about that and ask them about the state-sanctioned rape that Heinrich Himmler authorized across Nazi Germany and occupied Europe, then suddenly there's a blank.
Welcome to The Creative Asylum, a weekly podcast that digs deep into the minds of visionary creators of all stripes. Musicians, actors, filmmakers, writers, artists, cartoonists, and cultural disruptors. Here, we'll discuss perspectives of living life on your own terms. Life lessons that keep us grounded and sane, and sometimes pull us back from the edge. So, take a deep breath, loosen your grip on the bland and the boring. This is your weekly prescription for authentic living, creative clarity, and hopefully, a little bit of cultural rebellion.
Side effects may include spontaneous joy, existential epiphanies, and an uncontrollable urge to do weird and beautiful things.
Hey everybody, it's August 4th, 2026. My name is Daniel, and you're in the Creative Asylum. Today's conversation is with author Daniel Rachel. He is renowned for the definitive book he wrote on the two-tone movement called Too Much Too Young. But more recently, he's released this new book called This Ain't Rock and Roll, Pop Music, the Swastika, and the Third Reich. This is a conversation that we had in two sections, unfortunately. We had the first section scheduled, and because of a weird software glitch, suddenly he got cut out. So he was kind enough to reschedule with me. So there's a second section, and if you're watching on YouTube, you'll definitely see the shift between the first part of our conversation and the second part. Hopefully we'll have stitched together beautifully and you won't find any sense of discontinuity. Anyway, this book is amazing. It's a heavy read. It's incredibly well researched. I certainly recommend it if you have any interest in history or use of these kinds of symbology in rock and roll and pop culture in general. It's a great read. Highly recommend it. Let's go over the conversation between two Daniels, me and Daniel Rachel. All right. From one Daniel to another Daniel. Hello.
Hello.
And thank you for taking the time to come onto the Creative Asylum. I'm very excited for this conversation. I read the entirety of your most recent book. As we see right here, This Ain't Rock and Roll. We both have a copy. Most excellent. Yes. Pop Music, the Swastika, and the Third Reich. It triggered all sorts of things in my brain, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. There's a couple of points of reference for me personally that I've kind of connected with. One was my grandfather on my mother's side, who escaped Russia in 1910, Ukraine actually, on the underside of a train to basically escape the pogroms. So I had awareness of pogroms and anti-Semitism and the Holocaust very vividly through my entire childhood, and actually had the opportunity to speak to a couple of Holocaust survivors in my grandfather's living room growing up, because he had been a podiatrist, and even after he retired, he kept a few key patients on, and he would see them in his living room, and a couple of them were Holocaust survivors. And so I got to talk to them a little bit about that, and heard some very kind of chilling stories. The other point of reference for me, which is a bit more of a embarrassing point of, I guess, shame retrospectively. You and I both used to play music in bands, and I used to play in a band in Seattle some years ago. And there's this photo of me on stage. I was probably, I want to say 24 years old. And I was wearing a t-shirt that I often wore at that time, which was a reproduction of the Adolf Hitler World Tour t-shirt that you actually reference in the book. I look at that photo now and I'm just like, oh my God, this is so horrific and so embarrassing. And frankly, I don't really know what it was exactly that I thought at the time that seemed appropriate to be wearing that other than to just be edgy and snotty and, somehow controversial. And in retrospect, I'm just like, that's horrible. Anyway, let's talk about your book. Let's talk about the use of Nazi symbolism and theater and everything in terms of how it translates into rock and roll and pop culture and all of it, because that's really what your book is about.
Well, yes. I mean, it's interesting. The T-shirt that you wore, Adolf Hitler's European tour, was created by the manager of the Primitives, the band known for the magnificent single "Crash" and two brilliant albums in the late '80s. You could buy it on Oxford Street in London, and you could buy it in Birmingham, where I grew up in the Midlands. I thought it was funny actually as a teenager. I saw the humour in it, but I wasn't probably clever enough to see the damage and the harm
Sure.
and the responsibility probably somebody had to of what that signified and what it was sending out. But we go on journeys, don't we? I guess. And you speak of the pogroms. That's my family heritage, and of course is the backdrop of Fiddler on the Roof and Beyond the Pale, where the Jewish community had to live. And as we learn from Strummer and Jones on the big Audio Dynamite single.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about a lot reading this book was a couple things. One had to do with responsibility. One has to do with intentionality, I suppose. I think in some cases, people just gravitate towards the easy, plausible deniability kinds of excuses of I didn't know this or I didn't do that. But in some cases, I know that people literally have zero knowledge of certain bits of history and more as time goes on. I spoke to somebody not that long ago, a young woman, well, not that young, but in her 20s. And I mentioned something about the Holocaust, and she looked at me quizzically and said, "What is that?"
Well, that doesn't surprise me. Across America, as of the moment,
Especially America, yeah.
less than 25 states in America teach the Holocaust. Less than 25 states in
Right.
2026. Almost 8 decades after the liberation of the first concentration camp and extermination camps in occupied Poland. England started teaching the Holocaust in 1991. We didn't teach it in Ireland, Scotland, or Wales. This was more than 40 years after the liberation and freedom of oppressed Europeans. Holocaust Memorial Day was not introduced into the States or the UK until the early 2000s. So when you tell me, as many people do, that people have a lack of knowledge and understanding, then that makes perfect sense to me, because the education of children has not been deemed important enough to educate them about the worst atrocity, of the 20th century and perhaps any century. And yet, as I do my tours across Europe and talks across America, the amount of people that tell me that they know all this that's in my book is extraordinary. They know that the name Joy Division is the name of the brothel in Auschwitz, for example. That's what they say they know. I know all about Joy Division. And yet, when I unravel the story and ask them questions about that and ask them about the state-sanctioned rape that Heinrich Himmler ordered or authorized across Nazi Germany and occupied Europe, then suddenly there's a blank. This was knowledge to Joy Division.
Right, sure.
They knew about that. But I don't know if fans do or don't know these things. But if you are a Joy Division fan and you know that, might not know about the Dead Boys or the Ramones, or you might not know about John Lennon's Nazi memorabilia collection. You may not know about what Kanye West has been doing, or how Lady Gaga has used images associated with the Third Reich. And I guess what the book is trying to do is to say that there's a long history of many, many musicians all falling into similar usage of Nazi ephemera. And you may know about this, but you may not know about that. You may know a little bit about this, but do you know about that? And so what I tried to do was say, this is what musicians are doing. And and link it back to its historical reference. And I use the word history lightly in a way because that sounds like something old and boring and from the past. But we can't get away from the fact of what those atrocities were.
Sure,
And,
of course.
for myself, I went in 2023 to Poland on a solo trip. 800 miles I drove around on my own, and I went to all the existing Third Reich ghettos
Right.
and the remnants of the extermination camps. I went to 6 extermination camps in Poland just to get a sense of what this was, to understand it, and to pay my respects, really.
You
And
mentioned that in the epilogue.
yeah, so I
Yeah.
hope all of the book is embedded with that sense that we're just talking about individual people who were living lives, whether they were in Italy or Greece or Germany or Scandinavia or Russia or Poland or the islands off England or wherever else, having everyday lives like we are today, eating, drinking, buying clothes, listening to music and dancing, and then one day being taken and in many, many cases exterminated because they had a maybe a faith or a religion, maybe just because their heritage was that. And that's what rock and roll has to reconcile itself with, why it feels acceptable to use the imagery of those people that persecuted minorities, whether they were gay, Roma and Sinti, Slavs, Russians, Jewish people, and we use that imagery and ephemera to say, this is cool. Great, isn't it? They had the best costumes.
I think they did have the best costumes. I mean,
Really?
well, okay.
That's what you want to picture. Those costumes were designed by Walter Heck and Carl de Beach to instill fear and terror
Sure.
into
Okay.
people, into the SS and a party that wanted to take power
I'm
in
not just
1930s Germany. That's what those uniforms represent.
I
So do you think
understand
they're
that.
the best uniforms? Well, good
Well,
luck to you. Try wearing that down your local high
maybe
street.
that's not the right phrase. Saying the best costumes, maybe a better way of saying it is that they had a particular attention.
Yeah, then the
The Third
particular
Reich
attention to detail to instill fear. Let's get this right and straight.
To design in every aspect, and the intention had very specific messages attached to them. And I'm not justifying the use or the integration of those imageries. All I'm saying, and I think you even point to this in the book, is that there are certain aesthetic elements that people are drawn to. That doesn't excuse integration of those elements, particularly if you have a specific awareness of that history and where it comes from, how it was used, and why it was used. I'm just saying purely from an aesthetics standpoint, there's some reason, I believe, that extends beyond just simple anti-Semitism, why so many people have adopted these things, because there's some weird attraction to the power, the fear even, the militarism.
Your fellow American, Susan Sontag, wrote a fantastic piece in 1976 about Nazi uniforms and the fetishization of them, the sexuality of them,
right,
and male power represented by uniforms, which also became, in the Nazi regime, power that women used as well in a similar use of those uniforms.
Right.
But let's never forget that what that uniform represents. And it took the Nazis to power, out of fear, and it took millions of people to their death. And the representation of that uniform is what we must never forget.
I agree with that entirely. And I'm not suggesting we do. All I'm saying is that fetishization of that imagery and people that are drawn to that imagery, I think, are probably sometimes anyway done outside of context. Like I think a lot of people,
they may have done that out of context, but what is important, whether it's Lady Gaga or Madonna or Lemmy or Keith Moon, whoever you want to pick out of the tens and tens of people that are within this ain't rock and roll, who are wearing this uniform or using it in pop videos, using it on sleeves, using it as a fashion accessory, being photographed, they don't do it in isolation. They do it as part of a band, as part of being managed, of belonging to a record company, of an
Yes.
industry, the music industry, of the photography industry, of fashion.
An entire team of people that surround these individuals
People
and
don't
these
operate
artists.
as silos. And
Yes.
so I'm not saying that I'm pointing a finger at an
Uh-huh.
individual. I'm saying that these acts, and the most pertinent and latest example is Kanye West,
Yeah.
that he operates within an enormous network of people enabling his career, and his choice to sell a swastika on a t-shirt, to write a song called Gas Chamber, to write a song called Heil Hitler.
He's completely out there with all of it. He's not even hiding anything. I mean, it's what you're saying is that you have an entire infrastructure built around him that allow it all and that are accepting of it. So what do you do about that?
Write a book. What you do about it is you ask rock and roll to do something about it. And what's rock and roll done in the last 80 years? Virtually nothing. It's taken governments, the establishment, which rock and roll hate. Everything about rock and roll is meant to be anti-establishment. And at the end of the day, Kanye West has been banned from performing. Maybe in the States, is it Texas are about to ban him, in Australia, in Austria, in Italy, in the UK. It took governments to step in and say to the promoters, to the sponsors, we can't have people of this caliber of hatred on our stages entertaining people with the messages they want to share. Rock and roll should have done that, not a government.
Let me ask you something. Are governments themselves acting independently and making those decisions? Because from my cynical standpoint, I believe that the vast majority of time that governments don't often enough act independently to do the things that are right, and they only make certain decisions once there's enough pressure from us, the people, to tell governments, why are you accepting this? Why are you allowing this? And then under the pressure of public opinion, they will finally act and do the right thing.
Rock and roll had the opportunity to not book Kanye West in Britain in 2025 when they were organising the festival that he was going to headline. Nothing was done. The sponsors came on board. Nothing was done. Tickets were sold. Nothing was done. The government stepped in and they banned him. Great. I support that.
Yeah, me too. Me too. If you're enjoying this conversation, please make sure you hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please like this video, leave a comment, and if you haven't already, please subscribe. It's the quickest way to grow our channel, and it's absolutely free. You can also subscribe to our other channels on social media. Check out our Instagram at Creative Asylum CA, that's the letter CA, or on TikTok at The Creative Asylum, that's all one word. Our website is thecapod.com, and our Facebook profile is the same, facebook.com/thecapod. All right, back to the episode. Hello, Daniel. Thank you for coming back on. Apologies for the
New clothes.
Issues. New clothes. Yeah, I was actually wondering, should I wear a different shirt or the same shirt? And I'm like, yeah, I'll put the same one on.
Sack the continuity editor.
Yes. Well, that's right. Well, that's me. So I will be firing myself.
Sack yourself.
We were talking specifically about Kanye West and how the British government just said, enough is enough. We're not doing this anymore, and we're not going to platform you. And the whole conversation was, it seems that governments are being more responsible in their response than the actual institution of the music industry and rock and roll more broadly. So I guess my question is, like, why is that? And what do you think needs to be done? And then, do you think that the music industry has more of a responsibility to police the people that they're making money from to be more responsible in how they conduct their business?
Well, Kanye West, the cancellation in this country and the gig in London was because Pepsi pulled out, and due diligence should have been carried out before the booking. And if that's now going to be the new norm, then good, because they would have had an artist on stage singing Heil Heil, Sieg Heil, and then potentially tens and tens of thousands singing that would have reverberated around North London, and that would, for obvious reasons, be horrific and be a direct parallel to a Nazi rally in the 1930s. So
Yeah.
so the fact that it took the British government, rock and roll traditionally is against the establishment, but if rock and roll can't even face up to itself because they think it's cool
Mhm.
to allow neo-Nazis, as he is, outspoken, passionate, anti-Semitic, pro-Adolf Hitler, pro the Third Reich, it took the government, and I applaud them for doing it because rock and roll had 80 years to step in and didn't. But likewise, we've seen it happen in Australia, we've seen it happen in Austria, in Italy, in Spain, and
What
America.
year was that happened?
This year, 2026.
Okay. So the reason I ask is because the fact that Kanye West has been so pro-Nazi as long as he's been, this has been known about him for a very, very long time. So what was it this time that finally, what was the straw that finally broke the camel's back? Because he's been out and proud about all this stuff for so many years and he's
Yeah.
been allowed to perform, and all of a sudden something shifted. What was that shift that they finally said?
Well,
We
it's the
can't do, like,
publication of This Ain't Rock and
okay,
Roll.
there you go.
We got to.
Maybe it was. Maybe it was.
Well, my girlfriend went to a meeting with the Prime Minister in Downing Street, so maybe she
Mhm.
slipped him a copy, and that fed through to the
Could
Culture
that could be.
Minister. With Lisa Nandy. Maybe that's the passage. I'd like to think so. But what has changed? Well, firstly, I mean, it's appalling that it's been excused that he's bipolar, because it does a tremendous disservice to all those people that are bipolar
Mhm.
and do not offend masses by inane comments that he makes. He's also apologized and said but he's done that on 3 separate occasions.
Right.
What's different? When was the last time that Kanye performed in the UK? I'm not sure. Is that to do with it? Is because other countries have set a precedent? Because
Mhm.
because now, instead of making comments, he's actually put his anti-Semitism, his racism directly into lyrics, onto records. Is
Right.
that the difference? That you can't escape it now? Perhaps that's the difference. I mean, in a way, it's yeah, I mean, it is important. What's the difference? What's changing? But let's be thankful there is a change, and
Sure.
I think that due diligence, I think, has been applied to the British guitar dance band Primal Scream,
Mhm.
who are planning to perform their late 90s album Exterminator in the autumn. That they have a song on that called Swastika Eyes, in which the lead singer Bobby Gillespie has been seen to Sieg Heil when performing that at Glastonbury historically. And as recently as last winter, when they performed at the Roundhouse in North London, they projected images of the Star of David, the symbolism of Judaism, entwined with a Nazi swastika, and with people walking out and a national outcry. And due diligence has been done, and apparently the promoters have been assured that video will not be shown. But what will happen during Swastika Eyes, and whether that song is interesting. That's where we're at. Is this just an incident for Kanye West, or is it going to extend to other artists?
Right. Yeah. Well, I've always believed that part of that depends on pressure, be it industry, be it advertisers, be it governments. If there's not, I believe if there's not enough public pressure, that people will just go on business as usual. But when there's enough pressure, the people suddenly are in the spotlight, and they're like, oh, maybe we shouldn't stand behind this, and maybe we should actually take a position and take a responsible position. And I think that's in all cases.
Yeah.
Advertisers, industries, governments, I don't think any of them respond without pressure from us, ultimately. I'm kind of always put off by this mental health excuse, like, oh, it's not that he's a bad person, it's just that he's bipolar. Well, there's medication for that, and in America, I'm sure you're more than aware of the problems we have with guns and our addiction to guns in America. And on the right, what you always hear, and it's been going on for decades, is as a deflection from the fact that we allow so many guns and that we uphold our Second Amendment as this righteous cry for gun ownership, there's always this thing. It's like, oh, it's mental illness. We need to, it's mental illness. That's why people are getting killed and murdered. It's like, no, they're getting killed and murdered because there's so many guns. And the funny thing is that the people invariably that say, oh, it's mental illness are the same people that always cut, governmental assistance and budgets for mental health assistance.
The wider responsibility here is if Kanye West needs help, then that should be provided and facilitated by his team, his record company, his management. And if he is
Right.
if he is in such a state that he can't be accountable for the songs that he writes and the words that he speaks, then why are they absent in this? And that's very, very concerning. And I hope that Kanye West's team will support him and withdraw him from the music industry if this is the result of him just being free to talk and write and do whatever he wants.
Why would they do that when they're all making money? That's
Well,
my argument. It's like
there
as
you
long
are.
as
There you are.
people are making money, they're not going to cut off the very source of their income.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I have social compassion, and my compassion is to him if he has mental health problems and needs medical intervention of a sort.
I mean, you could also say, why is the head of our own government having him in the White House and, ultimately giving him a platform to further reach the masses? I mean, we have somebody in power right now who, personally I consider to be rather sympathetic to the ideologies of Hitler, especially when we come, not just Trump, but also with Stephen Miller in particular. And then you bring people like Kanye West and bring him into this public stage. That's just exacerbating the problem even more and sort of fueling the popularity. When
Yeah.
again, the responsible thing would be to go, he stands for ideologies that we can't support, unless, of course, you do support them. And I think in this case they do. I think they've kind of pulled him out of the limelight because he was just starting to get too cuckoo. But again, that came down to public pressure. There were the public pressure about them platforming him became so overwhelming that they just kind of pulled him from their roster, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, when I researched This Ain't Rock and Roll, I reread Mein Kampf
Mhm.
for second, possibly third time. And that was written to lay out the ideology
Right.
of the Nazi Party. And I wouldn't loosely infer that other leaders of modern contemporary governments are subscribing to that point of view, because
Mhm.
that was an explicit laying out of an intention to annihilate all European Jews.
Right.
That's the central theme of that book.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that brings us around to this whole discussion of education or lack thereof. And when we had our first conversation before you got cut off, we discussed for a bit just about the degree to which the Second World War and specifically the Holocaust is taught. That half the states in America don't even require it, that in the UK, it was in fairly recent history that they began teaching it. And I was mentioning that when I went to high school in the 70s, it was touched upon, but just barely. It was sort of part of the whole thing, but it wasn't central to any of the teaching around Second World War. We learned more about specific historic battles than we did more broadly about what the Holocaust was. Whereas in my mind, that should almost be the central tenet of the Second World War.
If you were born in the UK before 1977,
Yeah.
1978, you were only taught the Holocaust if a teacher decided to touch on that subject. I didn't learn it at school. It wasn't on the syllabus. It was never spoken about. It was only spoken in English schools as a government requirement from 1991 onwards, not in Scotland, not in Ireland, not in Wales, only in England. In America, 21 states, to my knowledge, teach the Holocaust. So the majority do not. But when you see people marching in Charlottesville saying Jews will not replace us, it's highly likely that those marchers have never been educated into the persecution of the minorities during 1930s Germany, whether they were gay, Roma and Sinti, Polish, Russian, Black, Jewish. That would have never been taught in a trusted place of school by a trusted source, a teacher.
Right.
That's incredible. Even Holocaust Memorial Day was not invented until, I think, 2003. We're talking, almost 50 years after one of the greatest atrocities in the history of mankind, if not the greatest atrocity. And so that lack of education, of teaching minds when they're open to form themselves and their values and their feelings towards mankind and the human race, mankind. That's the root of where all this is. But in what I'm trying to do in the book is I attempt to align any references to the Third Reich in music, in lyrics, in imagery to what its historical source was. Now, some people may know what Crystal Nat was when that's sung by various artists, and others will not. Some may know about the brothels in Auschwitz, which is what the Joy Division were, or Crystal Nat being the pogrom of 1938 when all businesses were set on fire and smashed and people were murdered. There's so many elements that need to be realigned, and that's what the book is attempting to do. So when people go around in their T-shirts and tote bags and images of the swastika, hopefully we can say, that belongs to something. This is a history, and that history was around annihilation and murder, rape, and all the kind of typical male tropes of power.
Do you think it's more shocking that you have pro-Nazi sentiment or anti-Semitic sentiment in Britain as opposed to the U.S.? And the context to this, why I'm asking, is because the American experience in the war versus the British experience in war was completely different in that London was bombed mercilessly. In Europe, everybody experienced that war on their shores, on their land, whereas U.S., it was always outside of. So I think from the U.S. perspective or the U.S. history, it's easier to understand that people might not have a sense of history. Whereas in the UK and in Europe, broadly, I would think that everybody would have the Second World War and hopefully as part of that, the Holocaust as part of their ongoing generational consciousness.
I mean, firstly, the bombing of Great Britain, it was Great Britain. Many, many cities, Newcastle, Liverpool, Coventry. It wasn't just London. Casualties from the bombing are surprisingly low comparatively. 20 million Russians, by example, died in the war. But I would not for one second want to do any kind of a league table of suffering between the Allied powers. Thankfully, America joined the war in 1941 to fight in Europe and across other continents. And any soldier that died in that conflict is as valuable as any person that died during the Blitz or whatever. But I think that the greater question here is why the Allies were fighting the war and why the Axis powers were fighting the war.
Mm-hmm.
Germany was fighting the war as it was explicitly laid out by Adolf Hitler, by Goebbels, by Goering, by any number of the leading Nazi parties. They were fighting a race war. And that race war was to get living space for German people, for the so-called Aryan race. The expansion across Europe into the Soviet Union was for living space, Lebensraum. And that is why they argued for the annihilation of 11 million European Jews to give living space. Now, that's why they were fighting the war. That is not the reason why America and why Britain were fighting they were not fighting to stop a race war. And that's exemplified by General McCarthy out in Buchenwald in April 1945 on camera. So you can watch this on film if you look it up on YouTube or wherever.
Mm-hmm.
And it says to camera, soldiers say to me, why are we fighting this war? And that's a shock because that's, this is April 45. Pearl
Right.
Harbor was December 1941. They still don't know. And then he says, with the funeral pyres of burning bodies behind him, he says, they sure as hell will know now.
Do you think we would have gotten into the war, the U.S., had it not been for Pearl Harbor? I've wondered
Well,
about
you
that
look at
several
Ken
times.
Burns' documentary,
Yeah.
which is incredible, US and the Holocaust, the 10-part series, so really brilliantly made and argued documentary that lays out everything you need. Well, not everything, but clearly lays out America's seduction of Nazism, hence 20,000 people at Madison Square Garden in the 1930s supporting,
Right.
and Charles Lindbergh and whoever else and the American Nazi Party. And obviously there would be children of children who form bands from those pro-Nazis. Whether they would have done, I think, like Britain, like America, people that were trying to flee Nazi Germany, not just Jewish people, were turned
Yeah.
away
Yeah.
shamefully by both of our governments. That says a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In the same way as we're seeing genuine, people fleeing war conflict today and not being welcomed into a safe place.
Yeah.
Echoes of the past in 2026.
I mean, we like to tell the history of all the people that we've allowed in our country and allowed on our shores. But the part of the history that people in America try to pretend doesn't exist is how many people we tried to keep from coming on our shores. And then also the degree to which almost every ethnic group that has come in or national group that has come in has had to experience all kinds of racism. I mean, the Irish experienced it.
Mm.
Germans experienced it. Like every group that we've had come in, the Japanese experienced it. Like that's part of the American identity, even if we don't want to accept that is part of who we are.
Yeah.
That we say you're all welcome on our shore for our big melting pot, but once you arrive, we're going to make life really miserable for you, and we're going to target you a lot, and it's going to take decades before you finally get integrated. Unfortunately, but that is the truth. And then, of course, now we have an administration that is, I mean, we've got an administration that's trying to overthrow one of our key tenets of birthright citizenship. And they almost got away with it just last week. It blows my mind, but, they did. Okay, I'm going off on a tangent. Let me ask you about the artists, be it pop artists, be it punk rock, whatever. Musical artists in the public eye who glorify or use or integrate Nazi symbols, be it the swastika or just uniforms or whatever. Do you think there's a significant way that artists can incorporate some of this kind of imagery in a way to make statements effectively against fascism as opposed to sort of glorifying it? Or do you think that it makes better sense that lines get drawn in the sand and just say, no, we're not going to do this for any reason, and we're not going to justify it in any way, shape, or form?
Are you suggesting that by wearing Third Reich clothing or imagery, it would help anti-fascism?
Well, I'm not suggesting, I'm saying, so I see a continuation of people still using these kinds of symbols, these kinds of visuals, and integrating it into whatever they're putting out there, either on stage or in video. And there is clearly an ongoing and continued attraction to some of these symbols, whether it's conscious that they're aware of what they represent or whether it's not. Do you think there's a way that can be integrated more as a warning against these kinds of things and a reminder of the history, unless you're just overtly expressly saying this is what happened and we're against it, because that's not what tends to happen.
I mean, you're asking whether the symbol of anti-Semitism can be used positively by artists.
Or maybe a better question is, why do artists continue to use it still in this day and age? Maybe that's the flip side of that same question.
Okay. Because they're attracted to the theatrical spectacle
Right.
of the Third Reich, which many artists have made not an entirely big noise outside something. I don't know what that is. I think Donald Trump has arrived in a helicopter. He thought he was on a golf course in the Highlands. There is a parallel, obviously, to be made between a Nuremberg rally that we saw through the lens of Leni Riefenstahl's camera in the 1930s with modern-day rock concerts, the seduction of an audience, the power of a single being on the stage. You only have to think of a Queen concert when Queen are doing, We Will Rock You, or
Yes.
such a song, and the arms are acting in unison, and that power. And Gene Simmons, who's born Jewish in Haifa in Israel, talked about that very thing with Kiss. David Bowie talked about it, and as a result wanted his stage design in the 1970s to replicate Nuremberg. That was his direction to the set designer, Nuremberg. Many, many artists have made references to it, and there is a parallel. But the introduction of the book is written by the songwriter Billy Bragg, and he sets the Riefenstahl test, as he calls it, and makes that connection between what those images stood for and what the end result was, which was the Holocaust. It's dangerous, loose talk to even be talking and making comparisons between rock and roll and a Nuremberg rally, let alone, like, for example, Nicki Minaj might do, restaging for the purposes of a pop video to sell your record.
And even if Nicki Minaj isn't fully aware of what these things represent, there are enough.
Nicki Minaj is fully aware.
She is. Do you think she was going into it as well?
Of course, because it's an exact. Her video is an exact replica of a Nuremberg rally, except for the swastika image on the banners is replaced with the logo of her record company.
Right.
Everything else is as if you're watching a graphic realization of a Nuremberg rally.
So outside of just overt education, which doesn't seem to be a priority in most governments, what do we do culturally and socially to stem this from continuing?
I mean, initially we have to acknowledge it and accept it. I'm not for one minute advocating for the burning of records like books in the 1930s, or books now in modern day America, where in certain states, Kill a Mockingbird is ripped off the shelves of a library and burnt on in a pile outside, which I've seen a documentary about. We have to acknowledge history and say it's there and it's a part of us, but we can then move forward. And perhaps I could make this argument that if for one moment we stop talking about the Third Reich and the use of the Nazi swastika, and we replace that image with the image of racism according to the color of somebody's skin, we wouldn't show the lynching of a black person, say in the deep south of America in the 1960s.
Right.
If that was shown now as part of a record sleeve or a video, that would be shut down, I would imagine, immediately. Likewise, we do not celebrate the images of sexual violence or rape since George Floyd and the Me Too movement. There's been a new consciousness. So we've moved forward saying there was a past and now we have to see a new sensibility. And that's all I'm suggesting, that with the tropes of the Third Reich, the same should happen.
I agree, absolutely. I guess my question is, how do we do this? And I don't know that I have the answer. I mean, writing a book, sure. And hopefully this will reach a lot of people. What sort of changes of minds do you hope that people will have from reading this book? And what do you think that we should do more broadly to just make these kinds of changes societally so that we don't have to be continually confronted with these kinds of symbols?
Well, I think on a one-to-one level, it's simply having the conversations. And on a larger level, it's contextualization, so every time that an image is reproduced, it should have a context to it. That doesn't happen at the moment. British newspapers will do features with swastikas and whatever else, and there'll be no explanation. That's an easy thing to do. When we talk about the Joy Division was where state-sanctioned rape happened in Auschwitz. It's just when you know something, you carry it forward with you, and it can start on literally on an individual basis. You know, it will, you know, the next time, you know, you pick up a Sex Pistols record and it's got a swastika on it, that hopefully will carry a sense of what this book is trying to talk. And then, you know, greater things can grow out of small things, you know. And it's just accountability and responsibility of people with the most power trying to do the most they can to redirect and talk about a history that has rarely ever been challenged, to my knowledge.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Creative Asylum. A quick favor before you go. If you liked this conversation, please be sure to follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every Tuesday at 10. You can find us on Instagram and on YouTube at Creative Asylum CA. That's Creative Asylum and the letters CA. Our website is thecapod.com. And our Facebook is the same, facebook.com/thecapod. Until next week, when we'll have a new conversation with another creative disruptor, stay creative in life and at work.